The morning began without incident. Over the volcanic ridges of Bougainville, the jungle steamed under a grey haze. At 7:45, mechanics of the 204th Air Group at Balali Airfield recorded a faint tremor, a low, uneven hum drifting from the northeast. To them, it was unlike anything they had heard before. Not the sharp, rising snarl of a Zero, nor the deep, even growl of a Japanese bomber formation. It was something foreign, metallic, and strangely synchronized. A crew chief wrote later in his diary, "It sounded like distant thunder, but with a rhythm like machines that had learned to breathe." That rhythm belonged to 18 American fighters, the Lockheed P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 13 Fighter Command. They had taken off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal 6 hours earlier, flying a route calculated to the minute by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lanphier and Captain Rex Barber. Each plane carried drop tanks, a precise fuel load, and a single purpose: intercept a Japanese transport flight at 9:34 over Bougainville. They had been told little else, only that the target would change the course of the war. At the same moment, 8 local time, a Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber lifted from Lakunai Airfield near Rabaul. Inside sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, and the most respected officer in the Imperial Navy. His staff officer, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, occupied the second plane in the small formation. 2 G-4Ms, escorted by 6 M0s of the 204th Air Group, rose over the bay and turned southeast toward Bouin. Yamamoto's schedule, precise to the minute, had been transmitted by radio the previous evening encoded in JN-25, the Japanese naval cipher the Americans had quietly broken months before. In Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO had intercepted it, translated it, and passed it through Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters. The decision to act came from top President Roosevelt himself, reportedly approved the mission with a single line: "Get Yamamoto." It was designated Operation Vengeance. At 8:45, over Bougainville's western coast, the American fighters split into 2 flights. Major John Mitchell led the first group, climbing to 20,000 feet to provide top cover. Below, Lanphier and Barber's division descended to treetop level, scanning the horizon for movement. Barber recalled in his 1985 reunion address, "The sun was directly behind us. The sky ahead was clear. I remember thinking, if he's there, we'll have one chance." At 9:34, 2 small glints appeared against the morning haze, 2 Betty bombers, line abreast, followed by 6 Zeros. The Americans turned to intercept. Lanphier pulled high to cover, Barber dove. The Japanese pilots never saw them until the first tracers stitched across the sky. The G-4M carrying Yamamoto took hits to the right engine. Barber's P-38 closed from below, firing a 5-second burst. Witnesses on the ground saw black smoke trail from the bomber's starboard wing. It began to roll, then broke apart in mid-air. Ugaki's plane dived into cloud cover and escaped, pursued by Lanphier. At 9:43, the wreckage of Yamamoto's aircraft came down in dense jungle near the mouth of the Aku River. Japanese soldiers from the 173rd Infantry Detachment reached the site hours later. They found the wreckage scattered across a clearing fuselage, ruptured, tail section lodged in the trees. Yamamoto's body was still strapped in his seat, katana resting across his lap. A doctor from the 204th Air Group recorded, "A bullet had entered the left shoulder and exited below the jaw. Death instantaneous. They built a small bamboo shelter over the remains and guarded it overnight. Back at Rabaul, word arrived by radio at 20. The initial report was vague, Yamamoto's aircraft overdue. By dawn the next day, confirmation came through the 8th Fleet staff. The reaction inside, Combined Fleet Headquarters, was unlike any prior loss. Officers stood silent, some refusing to speak. Admiral Kusaka, Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote in his personal log, "The Empire has lost its voice. What remains are echoes." No one outside the inner circle was told the truth. The official communiqué released to the press read, Admiral Yamamoto died in air combat while directing operations at the front. Yet, within the general staff, disbelief turned quickly to fear. How had the Americans known? How had they intercepted a plane flying more than 400 miles beyond their range? In Tokyo, naval intelligence examined the wreckage photographs and tried to calculate the range of the American fighters involved. Estimates varied, but even the most conservative concluded that no known Allied aircraft could have made the round trip without refueling. "It must be magic," one officer muttered. Others proposed a secret base on Bougainville, perhaps even sabotage within their own command. None suspected the real answer that their most trusted cipher, JN-25, had been compromised for months. At Rabaul, the surviving pilots of the 204th Air Group gathered for a memorial service. They stood beneath a makeshift flagpole at the edge of the runway, where Yamamoto's ashes were loaded onto a transport for Tokyo. Captain Kenji Yanagi, who had escorted the Admiral's plane that morning, later told interrogators, "We heard the sound before we saw them. It was not the whine of Zero engines. It was something deeper, like two saws cutting the same tree." The Americans returned to Guadalcanal at 11:45, engines nearly dry. Mitchell's logbook noted a total flight distance of 1,000 miles, the longest interception mission ever attempted at that stage of the war. The Teen Fighter Command filed its after-action report that evening. Target destroyed, 1 P-38 lost, 2 damaged. Across the Pacific, the death of Yamamoto reverberated through every command post of the Japanese Navy. But the real tremor, the one no one could yet name, was the recognition that somewhere, unseen, the enemy had combined machines, mathematics, and intelligence into a single instrument of war. In later testimony at the 1946 Allied Translator and Interpreter Section interrogations, Rear Admiral Ugaki admitted, "We did not believe they could reach us. We thought the Pacific was our shield. That day, the ocean became a mirror showing our own illusion." In that moment, the Empire had heard the sound of something it did not understand. It was not merely the engines of the P-38 Lightnings echoing over Bougainville. It was the first mechanical whisper of American power, a sound that would grow louder, month by month, until it filled the entire Pacific sky. And in the silence that followed the crash, as the jungle burned and the air settled over the wreckage, Japan's high command began to grasp, dimly, that the war they had started could not be fought by courage alone. The telegram arrived at 9:37 local time, carried by a runner whose boots were still wet from the morning rain. He didn't know the weight of what he carried. Few did. The paper, bearing the imperial crest, was addressed to Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commander of the 11th Air Fleet, stationed at Rabaul. It contained only a brief report. Communication lost with Admiral Yamamoto's flight. Search in progress. For a few moments, Kusaka said nothing. Those in the operations room recalled only the faint hiss of the electric fans and the damp clicking of typewriters. Then, in a tone that betrayed neither panic nor disbelief, he ordered his adjutant to dispatch every available reconnaissance unit toward Bougainville. Outside, the humidity hung heavy enough to choke. By midday, the truth began to seep in through broken transmissions and stammering radio calls from forward bases. An aircraft had gone down near Kahili. Locals had reported smoke curling up from the trees. A few hours later, confirmation came from a pilot of the 204th Air Group. One Mitsubishi G-4M bomber, codenamed Betty, had been found destroyed. No survivors. The crew had been riddled with .50 caliber fire. The jungle still burned. When the identification plate was recovered, there was no longer room for doubt. The serial number matched the aircraft assigned to Ryzen 323, Admiral Yamamoto's personal transport. At the time, Japanese intelligence officers could not yet grasp how the Americans had known. The itinerary had been classified under Gokuhi Maru Most Secret. It was transmitted through encrypted naval channels only hours before departure. Yamamoto's schedule was supposed to be invisible even to most of the Imperial General Staff. He was to visit forward bases at Balale, Buin, and Shortland to raise morale among exhausted pilots. The idea that the Americans had read their codes was dismissed, at least officially, as impossible. For years, the Japanese had trusted the Navy's JN-25 encryption system, a numeric code based on additive ciphers and frequently changed codebooks. Its complexity had lulled the High Command into believing in its invulnerability, but in a small, unassuming building thousands of miles away at Station HYPO, Pearl Harbor, U.S., Navy cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been quietly dismantling JN-25 for months. By April 1943, they could read portions of it with chilling accuracy. At 9:34 on April 13, Rochefort's team intercepted and decrypted a message detailing Admiral Yamamoto's inspection flight, including exact times, routes, and aircraft designations. It was the kind of intelligence so precise it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet, at the highest levels of the U.S. military, the decision was made. If they could reach him, they would strike. In Rabaul, though, no one knew any of that yet. They were left only with fragments. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who later documented the tragedy, recalled the eerie silence of the headquarters that afternoon. Officers stood around a map table, tracing the dotted flight path that had once been Yamamoto's. They marked the point of disappearance with a red pin, as if that could contain the enormity of what had happened. By nightfall, Kusaka sent word to Tokyo. The message was relayed directly to the Naval General Staff, where Admiral Shigeru Fukudome received it. It read simply, "Flagship aircraft of Combined Fleet Commander-in-Chief lost in action. Cause undetermined. Investigation continues." The following morning, reconnaissance planes returned with confirmation photographs, grainy images of the crash site, where a twisted G4M lay open like a crushed tin shell. The jungle had already begun to reclaim it. A search team recovered the remains of Yamamoto and his staff. According to the report filed by the 11th Air Fleet, the admiral was found still seated upright beneath a tree, his katana across his knees, a single bullet wound visible on his jaw. Witnesses noted that the body had not been burned. His watch had stopped at 9:35 a.m. When the news reached Tokyo, it was not immediately made public. The government understood the implications too well. Yamamoto had been more than a naval strategist. He was the living symbol of Japan's offensive spirit, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the embodiment of the Navy's confidence in its destiny. His loss was a wound that could not be openly shown. At the same time, within the halls of the Naval General Staff, a quieter panic began. The precision of the American ambush was too perfect. They had arrived at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, at a range of more than 400 miles beyond any reasonable coincidence. Some officers whispered what others dared not say aloud: "Our codes are broken." Yet even then there was hesitation to act. Changing the entire JN-25 system would mean halting operations, issuing new codebooks, and retraining every radio operator. In the Pacific, an enormous logistical undertaking. Pride and inertia worked together to delay the inevitable. The Japanese command preferred to attribute the loss to luck or espionage, anything but cryptologic compromise. In his post-war interrogation, Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, remembered his disbelief. "I could not believe they had read our signals. We had trusted the numbers too long. We thought the Americans were brave, but not brilliant." For the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 13th Air Force, the mission ended almost as soon as it began. Major John Mitchell led 18 P-38 Lightnings in a long, low-altitude intercept across the Solomons. They had flown at 50 feet above the sea to avoid detection by Japanese radar. 2 elements peeled off to cover against escorting Zeros. Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. and First Lieutenant Rex Barber made the attack. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. Both P-38 seconds fired on Yamamoto's bomber as it tried to bank toward the sea. It exploded moments later. A second Betty, carrying his staff officer, Rear Admiral Ugaki, managed to crash land in the jungle. He survived, later to confirm the sequence of events. Lanphier's radio transmission after the encounter was simple: "That's for Pearl Harbor." At Rabaul, The phrase would never be heard, only the echo of engines and the distant smell of burning avgas drifting over Bougainville's canopy. In the days that followed, the Japanese Navy prepared the official communiqué. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died in aerial combat on the 18th of April 1943, while directing operations in the southern area. His death is a glorious example of devotion to duty. The funeral was held in Tokyo weeks later, with full military honors. The public heard only reverent tones, not the disbelief, not the fear, not the creeping realization among the staff officers at Rabaul that this was more than a tragedy. It was a signal they had failed to hear, until it was too late. The war had ended in fire. Tokyo lay flattened, its veins of steel and glass melted into grey ash. By the time American occupation forces began their series of interrogations in late 1945, the Imperial Navy no longer existed in form, only in fragments of memory, half-burned files, and the haunted faces of men who had once believed in its invincibility. Among the earliest interviews conducted by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, was a quiet, meticulous session held inside the former Ministry of the Navy. The subject, Captain Takata Masazumi, Communications Officer for the 11th Air Fleet, Rabaul, in 1943. The transcript begins unceremoniously. Q. Did you ever suspect your operational codes were compromised? A. Not until Admiral Yamamoto was shot down. Even then, we told ourselves it was a coincidence. Takata was a thin man in his late 40s, his uniform threadbare, the silver anchor on his collar polished smooth from habit. He spoke with care, pausing often, as though still weighing the shame of the past against the relief of confession. We received the message of the Admiral's itinerary at 0600. It was marked Gokuhi Maru. We transmitted it as usual through the standard JN-25 system. There was no sense of danger. Our officers believed the Americans were too slow, too undisciplined to decipher numbers that even our best men struggled to keep straight. The interrogator, Lieutenant Commander Harold Greer, made a note in the margin. Subject displays disbelief even in hindsight. Indicates cultural confidence in code integrity. What emerged over months of questioning, cross-referenced with other officers' testimonies, was a portrait of an institution blind to its own fragility. At Rabaul, radio messages were handled by the 11th Air Fleet's Code Section, a cramped, sweltering room filled with cigarette smoke and stacks of cipher books bound in oilskin. Each message went through 3 stages: encoding into numerical groups, addition of random keys, and transmission in Morse. It was an elegant system on paper. In practice, the Japanese had failed to change their codebooks often enough, and American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO and Washington's OP-20G had exploited that flaw mercilessly. By April 1943, more than 80% of the Japanese Navy's traffic could be read within hours. Yamamoto's itinerary had been decrypted, translated, and relayed to Admiral Nimitz within a day. None of this was known to Takata or his superiors. When asked whether any officer had raised the possibility of compromise, Takata's answer was telling: yes, once. A lieutenant from the Communications Division, his name was Ito, suggested we might be too predictable in our traffic. He was reprimanded for defeatist thinking. Lieutenant Ito died later that year during an air raid. His name appears nowhere in official naval records. The interrogations continued for weeks. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, once head of the Naval General Staff's Operations Bureau, gave his own statement on the 2nd of February 1946. He was polite, even cordial, but his eyes hardened whenever Yamamoto's name was mentioned. We could not understand how the enemy found him. There was no spy, no leak. The only possibility was chance or divine punishment. I did not believe our codes could be broken by foreigners. Fukudome's logic, like so many of his peers, rested on the old naval creed of Bushido through technology that discipline, precision, and sacrifice themselves imbued machinery and numbers with spiritual invulnerability. The notion that mathematics, not morality, had doomed them was intolerable. Greer wrote in his report to the Air Intelligence Section, There persists among captured Japanese naval officers a collective refusal to equate American success with intellectual superiority. The destruction of Yamamoto is attributed to fate, not to intelligence. Only junior staff officers show awareness of systematic failure. But the truth had already been carved into history. Operation Vengeance was no miracle of fortune. It was the final proof that America's invisible war had reached full maturity. During a separate session, Commander Masatake Okumiya, who had helped draft Yamamoto's 1943 inspection itinerary, spoke with quiet regret. "I saw the message after it was sent. We believed we were safe because it was sent only hours before departure. We thought time was our shield. We could not imagine they already knew how to read us." He folded his hands on the table, eyes lowered. "I realized later that our entire understanding of war was wrong. We thought courage could replace calculation. But they, your people, fought with invisible weapons." When asked what he meant by invisible weapons, Okumiya answered without hesitation, "Intelligence. Machines, industry, mathematics. We had spirit. You had systems." By the spring of 1946, ATIS had compiled more than 1,200 pages of transcripts under the heading Japanese Naval Communications Practices. 1,945. Buried within the appendices was a remarkable memorandum unsigned, but almost certainly written by one of the American analysts who had spent long hours interviewing these men. The destruction of Yamamoto revealed to the Japanese the presence of an enemy who no longer fought conventionally. Their empire was built upon movement, courage, and surface visibility. The United States dismantled it with equations. In Tokyo, that realization spread slowly, almost imperceptibly, through the surviving circles of the old Navy. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, held at Yokota Air Base, several retired officers finally spoke openly about the event. Rear Admiral Toshikazu Ome summarized what many had come to accept. "When we learned that Admiral Yamamoto had been tracked by the interception of our own message, it was the first time we truly understood the scale of American power. We had believed their industry to be vast, but not their intellect. The war proved us wrong on both counts." The audience of scholars and veterans sat silent. Even 2 decades later, the wound remained raw. One of the most haunting post-war testimonies came not from a high-ranking officer, but from an enlisted radioman Petty Officer Hiroshi Nakajima, who had served at the Bougainville communications station in 1943. His statement, recorded in 1946 and rediscovered in the National Archives decades later, reads simply, "We heard the engines that morning. The sound was strange, like nothing we had known. When the Admiral's plane failed to return, we waited for orders, but none came. We only listened. Later, we learned the Americans had known everything. That sound we heard was the sound of their knowledge. Knowledge had become a weapon, one that struck without warning and left no smoke trails on the horizon. By the time the interrogations ended, the Japanese High Command, those who still lived, had reached a grim consensus. The loss of Admiral Yamamoto was not just the death of a man, but the death of a world view. Fukudome himself wrote in his post-war essay, The Lessons of Defeat. "We had prepared for a war of ships and aircraft. They fought a war of numbers, wires, and minds. When we lost Admiral Yamamoto, we lost the illusion that valor could defy modernity. It was perhaps the first and last time the old admirals admitted that the empire had never truly understood its enemy. By the fall of 1946, Japan was a nation of ruins and revelations. In the shipyards of Kure, where Yamato had once risen from steel and fire, the cranes now stood motionless, their frames bleached by salt and sun. American naval engineers walked the same catwalks once reserved for imperial officers, carrying clipboards instead of sabers. What they found beneath the debris of Japan's industrial empire was not merely wreckage, it was evidence of how profoundly the nation had misunderstood the machinery of modern war. Inside one of the surviving hangars, Allied investigators from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Pacific Theater assembled the remnants of captured aircraft. Fragments of Zeros, Ki-43 Oscars, Nakajima engines, all carefully tagged, photographed and catalogued. Among them, in a separate corner, lay a set of recovered blueprints labeled Toku Heiki special weapons. The Japanese had built them with courage and ingenuity, but courage could not forge chromium alloys or produce ball bearings by the millions. The visiting American engineers noted as much in their reports. Japanese aviation design is elegant but manually intensive, wrote Major Robert Scott. Their factories rely on craftsmen, ours on systems. In Tokyo, the same realization struck the disbanded officers of the former Naval Air Arsenal. For the first time, they were allowed to study American equipment up close: P-38 Lightnings, P-51 Mustangs, and fragments of B-29 superfortresses salvaged from the wreckage of raids. Many of these men had once dismissed American machines as crude. Now, they spoke of them with something approaching reverence. Captain Hideo Hori, a former engineer from Mitsubishi, later wrote, "We believed our pilots could overcome any mechanical disadvantage. After the war, when I saw how the P-38 was built, how every bolt, every rivet was standardized and interchangeable, I realized what we had truly been fighting. It was not a nation of pilots, but a nation of factories." In October 1946, a joint U.S.-Japanese technical exchange was held under the supervision of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. Among the subjects discussed was the reconstruction of Japan's civil aviation industry. But the conversations often drifted toward the war's deeper lessons. Rear Admiral Toshikazu Orme, present as a consultant, recorded the moment in his notes. One American officer said, "We did not win because our pilots were better. We won because our machines could teach men faster than men could teach each other." That sentence struck me deeply. I realized then that we had built an empire of bravery inside a century of science. The phrase empire of bravery would appear again in post-war Japanese writings, a term used to describe the tragic collision between two philosophies of war, one rooted in the spirit of the samurai, the other in the discipline of the assembly line. In a back room of the former Nakajima Aircraft Works, technicians under Allied supervision examined one of the surviving G-4M Betty bombers, the same type that had carried Yamamoto to his death. Its construction was lightweight, almost delicate. The skin of its fuselage was thin enough to puncture with a gloved finger. Its unprotected fuel tanks had turned countless flights into flying torches. When compared to the rugged aluminum frames of American bombers, the contrast was merciless. An American engineer remarked that it was as though one nation built its aircraft to endure war, and the other built theirs to defy it. The Japanese engineers took notes in silence. Later, one of them, Kazuo Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, would write in his memoirs, "We pursued perfection in flight, not in production. The Americans pursued production, and through it, they achieved perfection in flight." It was not an admission born of shame, but of clarity. Horikoshi understood that Japan's faith in the exceptional individual, whether pilot, craftsman, or admiral, had blinded it to the collective intelligence that powered American industry. At the same time, U.S. officers overseeing the demilitarization effort compiled their own reflections. The Strategic Bombing Survey concluded bluntly, Japan entered a modern war with medieval assumptions about industry and information. Courage cannot replicate a conveyor belt. Those words circulated quietly, among the Japanese staff assisting the Americans. Some copied them into notebooks, others dismissed them as arrogance. But among the younger engineers and officers, a seed had been planted, the understanding that power was no longer measured by steel tonnage or fleet size, but by the capacity to organize complexity at scale. When veterans of the old Imperial Navy gathered at the 1946 Kyoto Memorial Service for the War Dead, the atmosphere was heavy not only with grief, but with something colder, comprehension. For the first time, surviving members of the combined fleet publicly acknowledged what had remained unsaid since 1943, that Admiral Yamamoto's death had not been an isolated misfortune. It had been a revelation. Rear Admiral Rairunosuke Kusaka, once Chief of Staff at Rabaul, was among those who spoke that day. His words were simple, and they carried through the silent courtyard. When the admiral fell, we thought the gods had abandoned us. Now we know it was not the gods, it was mathematics. Across the Pacific, in Washington, American analysts filed their final reports. One summary from the Air Force Historical Research Agency described the event in terms that bordered on poetry. The 18th of April, 1943, was not merely a tactical success. It was the first clear echo of a new age, the age where thought traveled faster than courage. The Japanese, in their own way, came to the same conclusion. By the end of 1946, as Reconstruction began and demilitarization took hold, a phrase circulated quietly among former officers. America no chikara wa miranu. American power is invisible. It was an admission not of defeat, but of awakening. For when the Japanese High Command finally understood American power, it was not in the roar of bombs or the glow of Hiroshima, but in the quiet realization that the enemy's greatest weapon had never been its machines, it had been its mind. By 1947, the war's architects were ghosts in plain sight. The men who had built the invisible empire of American intelligence, the cryptanalysts, mathematicians, and engineers returned quietly to civilian life. There were no medals for them, no parades down Pennsylvania Avenue. Their triumphs had to remain secret, sealed within vaults under the title Top Secret Ultra. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the man whose team had deciphered Yamamoto's itinerary, was one of them. After the war, he was reassigned to an obscure post at the San Francisco Naval Shipyard, his contribution to Operation Vengeance left unacknowledged. In an internal memo, he wrote simply, "History will not remember us, but perhaps peace will." For the Japanese officers interrogated after the war, that silence was its own kind of revelation. They had spent decades glorifying decisive battles and visible heroics. Yet, the Americans had waged a war that was neither seen nor celebrated, a war of interception, logistics, and precision. When Japanese historians in Tokyo began compiling their first post-war naval chronicle in 1947, they requested official documentation from the U.S. Navy about the circumstances surrounding Yamamoto's death. The response was polite, brief, and incomplete. Details of code-breaking were omitted entirely. The Americans had no intention of revealing that they had read the enemy's thoughts as easily as radio signals. The Japanese editors were puzzled. One of them, Professor Iwao Horiuchi, later recalled, "It was as if they had erased their own victory. We expected arrogance. Instead, we found discretion." Across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy's cryptologic archives in Washington were sealed under layers of classification. The analysts who had once pored over strings of intercepted ciphers now taught mathematics at universities or managed post-war telecommunications firms. Their work remained buried beneath the surface of public history, an intentional omission. The policy was clear. America's code-breaking advantage must never be fully disclosed. Even the phrase Operation Vengeance was sanitized in official reports, described only as an intelligence-led interception. In Tokyo, meanwhile, former Japanese officers tried to reconstruct what had happened with the few scraps of information available. Without access to Allied decryption records, they were forced to rely on deduction. By 1947, the theory that American cryptanalysts had penetrated JN-25 was widely accepted within academic circles, though officially denied by the U.S. government. Admiral Fukudome, then living in quiet retirement in Kamakura, wrote a letter to an American liaison officer that year. It was never published but preserved in the archives of the National Institute for Defense Studies. When I realized the Americans had not merely fought us but had read us, I began to understand defeat as more than a military event. It was an intellectual conquest. At the same time, the surviving officers of Japan's communications divisions gathered periodically to discuss the reorganization of Japan's post-war maritime forces. Among them was Captain Takata Masazumi, the same officer interrogated by the Allies months earlier. His notes from one meeting capture the shifting mindset of the new Japan. If courage was once our foundation, then comprehension must be our future. The lessons of Operation Vengeance had evolved into something larger, a recognition that the future belonged to nations that could master the unseen: science, information, and coordination. In Washington, a quiet parallel unfolded. American intelligence leaders, already preparing for the Cold War, looked to the lessons of 1943 as a blueprint. The secrecy surrounding Yamamoto's death became a model for managing invisible power, the ability to act decisively while leaving no trace. By 1947, as the National Security Act gave birth to the Central Intelligence Agency, many of the same cryptologic officers who had tracked Yamamoto were quietly advising its early directors. Their success had proven a timeless truth that the greatest victories were those no one could ever verify. And so, in that year, as Tokyo rebuilt and Washington rearmed, both nations carried forward the same inheritance, one born of silence and of understanding. For the Americans, the silence was protection. For the Japanese, it was reflection. And beneath it all, the echo of the 18th of April 1943 still lingered, the sound of two engines over Bougainville, the sound that had once changed the course of empires. In the spring of 1952, the jungle of Bougainville was reclaiming what the war had left behind. Roots had torn through rusted fuselages, vines had strangled the remnants of fuel drums, and the crash site where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto met his end was now a cathedral of silence. The villagers of Moila Point had learned to avoid the area at dusk, saying the forest still carried the whisper of engines. That year, a joint Japanese-American research team arrived on the island, part of an unofficial reconciliation effort between former enemies. Among them was Lieutenant Commander John Mitchell, the pilot who had led the P-38 squadron that ambushed Yamamoto. Time had silvered his hair, but his eyes still held the calm precision of a combat flyer. Standing beside him was Captain Takata Masazumi, a former Japanese naval officer who had once decrypted American messages for the Imperial Navy. Two men who had once existed on opposite ends of an invisible battlefield now stood side by side, facing the same tangle of vines. The local guide led them into the jungle. Mosquitoes whined in their ears. A damp mist hung in the air, and beneath the heavy canopy, the light fractured into pale, trembling shards. When they reached the clearing, the remains of Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber lay scattered like bones of some extinct creature, aluminum corroded to powder, wings half buried under layers of earth and moss. Mitchell crouched down and touched the fuselage. "We hit him somewhere around here," he said softly. "Two bursts, clean shot." Takata remained silent. He removed his cap, bowed slightly toward the wreckage, and whispered something in Japanese, an old naval prayer for the dead. For several minutes, neither spoke. The only sound was the distant call of jungle birds and the soft hiss of the wind against the leaves. Later that afternoon, the two men sat near the wreck, sketching its outlines for the report. It wasn't just about recovery, it was about remembrance. Takata finally broke the silence. "Do you know what we thought, Commander, when we first heard of Yamamoto's death?" Mitchell shook his head. "We thought it was fate," Takata said. "Our Navy called it divine punishment for arrogance. But now—" He glanced around the clearing. "Now I understand it was not fate, it was calculation. Precision, a product of minds, not gods." Mitchell studied him for a moment, then replied, "War always pretends to be chaos, but underneath, it's arithmetic. Every decision was numbers, fuel, altitude, coordinates, distance." He smiled faintly. "I suppose that's how we both lived through it." Takata nodded. "And how millions did not." The jungle grew darker as the day slipped away, and the researchers began packing up. But Mitchell and Takata lingered, reluctant to leave the ghosts behind. For both men, this clearing represented a kind of reckoning, not just for what had been done, but for what had been hidden. That night, at the field camp near Bouin, Mitchell couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, reading the small leather notebook he had kept since 1943. In it were rough sketches of the P-38 formation, fuel calculations, and a line he'd written the day after the mission: "Success feels quiet. Perhaps too quiet." Across the fire, Takata noticed the notebook. You still keep your logs? He asked. Mitchell nodded. Old habit. Helps me remember what it was like to be sure of something. Takata stirred the embers with a stick. And are you still sure? Now? Mitchell looked up. About Yamamoto? Yes. About what it meant? No. The next morning, the group revisited the crash site for final documentation. As they prepared to leave, Takata took out a small wooden box. Inside was a white paper tag with 3 kanji characters, Shanban Wushilo, Isoroku Yamamoto. He placed it gently atop the rusted wing. I brought this from the naval shrine in Tokyo, he said. The families asked that we return part of him to the soil where he fell. Mitchell watched silently. The gesture wasn't for ceremony, it was for closure. When the helicopter came to collect them, Mitchell took one last look at the jungle below. The wreckage was barely visible, swallowed by the trees. Yet he knew it would remain there long after both nations forgot the details of April 1943. That same year, a small article appeared in an American aviation journal, former U.S. and Japanese officers have conducted a joint visit to the site of Admiral Yamamoto's crash in Bougainville. The purpose was historical documentation. No mention of reconciliation, no acknowledgement of the strange brotherhood that had formed in the jungle that week. But among the few who were there, something fundamental had shifted. Mitchell returned to California and left the Air Force soon after. He spent his later years writing about ethics in aerial warfare, often referencing the unseen wars, those fought not just with bullets, but with information. He never published his wartime logs, though a handwritten note on the final page read, "In the end, we learned that precision is not the opposite of mercy. It is what makes mercy possible." Takata, on the other hand, became a professor at Keio University. He taught military history and communications, lecturing on the transformation of Japan's post-war defense philosophy. Whenever he spoke of Yamamoto, he described him not as a martyr or a hero, but as a symbol of the age that ended when men learned to think in signals rather than slogans. Years later, when the story of Operation Vengeance was finally declassified, both men were already gone. Their correspondence, exchanged over the years, told a quieter story, one of respect between adversaries who had once hunted each other through the skies. And on Bougainville, beneath the roots and vines, the wreck still lay untouched. The jungle had finished what history began, swallowing everything except the memory of the sound. 2 engines, closing fast, over an endless green sea. It was not vengeance, it was mathematics. And it was the end of one world and the beginning of another. In the decade after the war, as Tokyo's skyline rose from ash and Washington's marble corridors filled with the hum of typewriters, the story of Operation Vengeance faded quietly into the background of a world obsessed with the nuclear age. Yet beneath that new frontier of atomic diplomacy, a quieter revolution was underway, one born not from bombs, but from information. The men who had once intercepted Yamamoto's itinerary were now grey-haired analysts in a new kind of war, one fought through antennas, radio waves, and cipher machines. To them, the 18th of April, 1943, was not simply a tactical success. It was the prototype of the information striker mission, proving that data could be deadlier than ordnance. In Washington, the National Security Agency, NSA, was founded in 1952, absorbing remnants of wartime intelligence groups like OP-20G and the Army Signal Intelligence Service. Many of its early officers cited Operation Vengeance as a precedent case, the moment America realized that war would increasingly be won by those who listened better, not those who shouted louder. Declassified internal memos from the Air Force Historical Research Agency confirm that the P-38 seconds mission had been referenced in training materials for code-breaking and strategic interdiction. One document from 1955 labeled the operation the purest execution of SIGINT warfare in World War II. Meanwhile, in Japan, the echoes of that lesson rippled differently. At Keio University, Professor Takata Masazumi, now in his early 50s, delivered a lecture titled The Age of Decoded Wars. He began by projecting a grainy photograph of Yamamoto standing on the deck of the battleship Nagato, his white gloves immaculate, his face calm. This man, Takata told his students, believed the decisive battles of the Pacific would be fought by ships. But his death revealed a truth he could not have foreseen: the battlefield had already moved into the invisible. He wrote 3 words on the blackboard: information, precision, isolation. These are the elements of power, he said. Not artillery, not empire. Whoever controls the first 2 can prevent the third. In the audience sat a young officer from Japan's nascent self-defense forces, taking furious notes. Within 20 years, that officer would oversee Japan's first electronic warfare training division. Across the Pacific, in a quiet office at the Pentagon, General Curtis LeMay reviewed a memorandum titled Lessons from Precision Interception, Pacific Theater, 1943. Though few would ever see it, the memo linked the principles behind Operation Vengeance directly to the emerging doctrine of preemptive intelligence warfare, the concept that would later define Cold War strategy. The memo concluded, "The killing of Admiral Yamamoto did not alter the outcome of the Pacific War. It altered the concept of how future wars are fought. The message became the weapon." LeMay underlined that sentence in red pencil. By 1957, Japanese and American officers began meeting in secret symposiums to discuss joint communication networks, spurred by growing Cold War anxieties. At one such conference in Honolulu, a retired Japanese admiral reportedly remarked over whiskey, "We used to measure power by the size of our ships. Now, it seems, by the length of our cables." It drew quiet laughter, but everyone in the room knew the truth. Yamamoto's death had forced Japan to abandon the myth of divine invulnerability and pushed America to institutionalize the science of intelligence. One empire had fallen because it could not conceal its movements. The other had ascended because it could read what others tried to hide. In 1960, on the 17th anniversary of Operation Vengeance, a small ceremony was held at Lockheed's Burbank plant, where engineers unveiled the prototype of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. A reporter asked one of the designers what had inspired its long, slender frame. He smiled and said, "The P-38 Lightning, the one that got Yamamoto." The remark drew chuckles. But historians would later note the irony: the U-2 represented the same principle the P-38 mission had proven, that altitude, precision, and information superiority were the new trinity of modern war. Back in Tokyo, a small exhibit opened at the Yasukuni War Museum, featuring Yamamoto's recovered sidearm, wristwatch, and fragments of his plane. The placard beside them read simply, "He knew America better than we did." But he did not know what America would become. Visitors stood quietly before the display. Older veterans bowed. Young students read the inscription twice. The exhibit did not glorify or condemn. It merely reminded them of a moment when Japan had realized that its understanding of power had expired. In Washington, declassified excerpts from post-war Japanese interrogations began circulating among scholars. One particular testimony, from Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's former chief of staff, appeared in the 1962 proceedings of the U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium. Ugaki's statement read, "When we learned that Yamamoto's flight had been ambushed, we refused to believe it at first. But when we confirmed the accuracy of the American attack, the timing, the altitude, the interception vector, we realized that the United States possessed a form of warfare we could neither see nor answer. It was as though they had looked into our thoughts." That single paragraph would become one of the most quoted in Cold War military circles. Analysts cited it as evidence of the psychological threshold crossed in 1943, the moment Japan stopped seeing America as an industrial giant and started seeing it as an intellectual one. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, most of the men connected to Operation Vengeance had retired or passed away. But the doctrine it birthed, the doctrine of preemptive intelligence, data-driven warfare, and strategic invisibility, had become the foundation of both nations' post-war defense philosophies. And though textbooks would remember Yamamoto's death as a dramatic ambush, the officers who studied it in military academies saw something else entirely: the convergence of machine and mind. In his final public interview before his death in 1961, Takata was asked what he believed Yamamoto would have thought of modern warfare of satellites, radar networks, and guided missiles. He paused before answering. He would have understood it immediately, Takata said, because he always knew war was not about killing the enemy. It was about understanding him first. He looked into the camera. That is what the Americans understood before we did. The sound that had haunted the skies over Bougainville, the low, twin-engine hum that the Japanese once called unnatural, had become the sound of the modern age, the vibration of unseen power. It was no longer a sound of fear. It was the signal of a world permanently rewritten by the logic of precision. In the quiet meeting rooms of post-war Tokyo, far from the cameras and parades of renewal, Japan's surviving admirals met behind closed doors to discuss a subject they had avoided for 20 years, the death of Isoroku Yamamoto, and what it had truly meant. The setting was austere, a small tatami room inside the old Navy Club of Tokyo, rebuilt after the war as a private gathering place for veterans of the Imperial Navy. By 1965, the men who entered its doors walked slowly, their uniforms long replaced by dark civilian suits. Among them were Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi's aides, several staff officers from the old combined fleet, and a few younger men from the self-defense forces invited to listen. There was no agenda, no public record. Only tea, silence, and the weight of hindsight. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, former Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, opened the discussion. His voice was calm but brittle. In April 1943, he began, we lost more than our commander. We lost the illusion that courage could replace comprehension. A few nodded. Others stared down at their cups. Fukudome continued. When the Americans intercepted his itinerary, they did not do so by luck. They did it because they had already mapped our system of thought, our patterns, our confidence. It was not just code-breaking, it was mind-breaking. An aide, once a signals officer, spoke softly. I remember the message, he said. Yamamoto traveling tomorrow, departing Rabal 0600. We believed it unreadable. We believed everything we made was sacred by discipline. He looked up. We did not understand that mathematics was also a form of faith. The discussion moved from memory to confession. Captain Yano Tetsuo, who had served as liaison to the Army General Staff, said, after the war, I studied the American documents. They knew Yamamoto's route down to the minute. They knew because they trusted their machines more than their pride. He sighed. We had no such trust. We still believed in men, not in systems. It was noble and fatal. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, a train rattled past the nearby station, its metallic rhythm echoing faintly through the paper walls. Finally, Fukudome said, there is a phrase Americans used after the war, the Yamamoto precedent. It means to strike an enemy leader with information rather than force. They turned our tragedy into a manual. Years later, transcripts from that meeting recorded unofficially by a younger officer were discovered in the archives of the Defense Agency Research Office. They revealed something remarkable. Japan's naval survivors were not mourning defeat. They were dissecting ignorance. One line from Fukudome's notes read, we built an empire of obedience. They built an empire of understanding. That was the difference. Another officer added, if Yamamoto had lived long enough to see his own death analyzed, he would have approved of it. By 1975, Japan's post-war generation was beginning to re-examine the legacy of its wartime leaders. New historians published essays arguing that Yamamoto's death had not merely symbolized military failure, it had symbolized the collision between intuition and intelligence. At a symposium at Kyoto University, Professor Hideo Kurosawa presented declassified excerpts from American combat reports alongside Japanese diaries. He concluded his lecture with a quiet statement that drew murmurs across the hall. In 1943, Japan still believed power was visible. America had already learned it was not. The remark became known in academic circles as Kurosawa's paradox, the idea that Yamamoto's death revealed not the end of Japan's might, but the beginning of its realization. In the 1980 seconds, during a veterans' memorial in Kyoto, a group of aging naval officers revisited the conversation one last time. Many were frail, leaning on canes. Among them was Takata Masazumi, his hair white, his eyes sharp as ever. He had returned from the jungle of Bougainville decades earlier with something resembling peace but never closure. When asked to speak, he arose slowly and addressed the audience of scholars and young cadets. "There is no dishonor in defeat," he said, "only in refusing to understand why it came." He paused, looking over the sea of faces. Yamamoto's death taught us that intelligence is not cruelty, it is clarity. The Americans showed us that the mind, not the bomb, decides the future. The hall was silent. "We once laughed at the noise of the P-38 seconds," Takata continued, "that strange hum that did not sound like ours. But that sound was the future approaching. We just did not yet know its name." He stepped back from the podium, his hands trembling slightly. When Takata died in 1985, a small note was found in his papers, written in his old, careful hand. "The Americans did not destroy our empire. They taught us what an empire of ideas looks like." That line would later appear etched into a plaque at the National Museum of Japanese History, beneath a rusted fragment of the G-4M Betty bomber that once carried Yamamoto. The inscription did not mention revenge or defeat. It read simply, "In that quiet admission, spoken not in surrender, but in understanding, Japan had finally articulated what its commanders could not in 1943. That power was no longer measured in battleships or banners, but in the unseen precision of thought." Operation Vengeance had ended with the sound of engines fading over Bougainville, but its echo remained in every coded transmission, every data link, every new generation that sought not to fight the invisible, but to master it. And so, in the end, the Japanese High Command's final understanding was not that they had been defeated by America's weapons, but by America's way of thinking.